Thank everyone for being here today. Happy to be a part of it, to share what we've learned with you, and want to thank you going forward for the work you're going to do through the network to end family homelessness.
So Christina is willing to answer a few questions that people might have. She also will be leading one of the breakout groups so that you could meet with her in a little while. But are there some questions for Christina? And we have wireless mics on each aisle.
Yes, Christina, Channing Wag of the Advocacy Network. Data seems to be a pretty important element in tracking and monitoring and measuring the results of actions taken. Where would you recommend we go in general to get the kind of data that I'm assuming is available through the federal and state governments, but isn't necessarily easy to find sometimes? Can you give us any insight into that?
Sure. Do you mean the data on the number of kids and families who are homeless, or other types of?
Well, I guess the whole shebang. You know, we hear gross numbers, millions of people at the poverty level, but, you know, down to a little more granular detail as to where the homeless people are in Massachusetts, by county, by town. Perhaps some economic data, anything else that would help us to better understand what's causing it and what we can do to get at the root causes of that.
So there are several different sources of data about homeless kids and families. You've hit on a topic that is quite complicated from the federal government down, but the U.S. Department of Education counts the number of kids who are homeless in school districts that school districts are identifying and providing services to. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development also counts people who are homeless, whether they're single or youth or families, and they're counting those through local point-in-time counts, which are conducted in January each year on one particular night and are run by communities. Other local places that are serving kids and families who are homeless are counting as well. It's really hard, it's tricky because many people who are homeless don't necessarily want people to know that. It's hard for people to go forward even if they know that there are services out there for them because they don't want to be perceived as being homeless. So sometimes, well, I always say that these numbers, unfortunately, I really believe strongly are undercounts because of that problem. Not the problem, but because people are not necessarily identifying themselves. And I think as far as program data goes, we do have some resources on the National Center on Family Homelessness website about what we believe are important program components for serving kids and families who are homeless. For example, I mentioned a couple of times that kids and families who are homeless can be separated, and so one of the things that we put forth to people is that programs should keep kids and families together as much as they can possibly. So that's a little bit about the data, and then there's some resources on our website about good program components if you're looking at programs in the community. Programs themselves keep their own data too, so it's very kind of a big question.
Good afternoon, Christina. Thank you very much for speaking to us. I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge, and I serve as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, so very much overlooking the state of Massachusetts' approach to reducing homelessness. And clearly we have a lot of innovative approaches here in Massachusetts to reduce homelessness, whether nonprofit organizations like Homes for Families or the administration or legislative efforts. I'm just wondering if there are innovative efforts in other states that you could highlight, maybe an example or two, of particular programs that have been particularly successful at reducing homelessness in other, whether it's a city program or other states?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you, Senator. Massachusetts does have a number of innovative programs, and when you look at Massachusetts compared to other states, it does have more than many other states have. We did, the National Center did run a pilot project for 5 years that was in 4 different places around the country, not here in Massachusetts, but Chicago, 2 places in California, and a place in Minnesota. It was really looking at how to address and end homelessness for kids and young parents with young kids. And what they found was really significant as far as helping the moms and also making sure that the kids' development was on track, was bringing systems together. So really often the homelessness shelters are working on one track, the kids programs are working on another track, and the child welfare programs working on yet a different one. So those pilot programs were community approaches where they brought people working in each of those systems together, and they figured out how to assess the kids and families and look at what each family and kids' specific needs were, and then how to refer them across the spectrum of services. And the kids' development really improved as a result. So I think the services individually are really important, but what's also really important is the coordination and collaboration. And it's been really great. The Mass Interagency Council on Homelessness and the Youth Commission are really looking at ways to foster that collaboration. I can follow up with you afterwards for more information about that. But in addition to providing the services, it's really bringing all those systems together and getting the kids identified for what specific services they really need and getting them into those.
Living with Homes for Families. And I'm curious, in that model, it sounds very interesting. What was the housing component that made the housing actually affordable to these families?
That's a really good question, and it differed in each community what specific housing was available, because the communities ranged from Chicago to a more rural community in California. So you couldn't really compare across. But I can follow up with you, and Libby, I know, works with my colleagues, so we can make sure you get the information about that. There's a question down in the front.
I'm curious if you have any sense of what the possible effect will be of the current federal budget cuts. Will sequestration limit the amount of money that's available to Massachusetts through the federal budget?
I hope not, but it's definitely at risk. I know I was just talking to our policy director who's based in Washington, and the sequestration deadline was on Friday, but it's going to take a couple of months if it goes into effect for the cuts to get down to the programs. Right now they're going to continue at the current levels until they can figure something out. At least that's what she told me on Friday. But the programs for kids and families who are homeless, many of them are funded at the federal level, down to the state, down to the local program levels. And so when you see across the board cuts, it's going to impact the kids, and it's going to impact the programs that are serving the kids and families. So any advocacy that you can do locally is really important, but also advocacy at the federal level about these funding for these important programs is really significant.
But tonight, we're fortunate to have with us Lizbeth Heyer, who is Associate Director of Public Housing and Rental Assistance with the state. She's been the Associate Director since 2009, leader in gubernatorial initiatives to reduce family homelessness, expand affordable housing resources for extremely low-income households, and preserve the 45,600 unit state-aided public housing portfolio. I will not trouble you to read all of this, but we're delighted to have Lizbeth here, and we want very much to hear from her about the progress and the effectiveness and where we're going with the state program. So please help me to welcome Lizbeth Heyer.
Thank you, Frank. So let me start by thanking you all for having me here, and I really want to thank everyone in this room, the passionate leaders from the Advocacy Network, and our elected representatives for, again, giving up your Sunday afternoon. This is a really important topic, and I am honored to be here to talk to you on behalf of the governor about the initiatives to build out the affordable housing infrastructure, expand resources, and really focus on how do we prevent family homelessness and how do we provide more resources and more opportunities for people to have that permanent affordable housing, which we know ultimately is the solution. And thank you to Christina for pointing that out. Absolutely, the core problem is that we have a structural gap between the incomes of many families who struggle, many families who are working who struggle to make enough money to provide the housing for their families at the cost of housing in this state. And that is a significant problem. I'm going to share some data with you in a little bit to illustrate that more. But I think my job this afternoon is to talk about the difficult puzzle and the challenge that we have to work within resources that have expanded under the leadership of the Patrick Murray administration for affordable housing and homelessness prevention, but admittedly are still not enough to provide that permanent affordable housing for every single family and individual that needs it. And how do we take that puzzle on and do what we all know is right and why you're all here today, which is to fight to end family homelessness. So what I'm going to do this morning, this afternoon, excuse me, is walk you through what the Patrick Murray administration's vision has been, which is really about a combination of dramatic reinvestments and expansion in investments in housing while supporting a responsible shelter safety net and the proud entitlement for shelter that we support in this state. I want to talk to you about some facts that I think really help underscore this vision and have really created the roadmap for the strategy that the administration has put into place. And then thank you to Frank and all of you for actually sending me some questions in advance of this presentation. I'm actually going to address your questions directly in my talk and then, of course, be available after that and share a little bit about where we're going. Because as you all know, the governor has released his proposed budget for the next fiscal year, which outlines the vision for the next steps as the administration sees it in taking on this challenge. So we've talked about this, and Christina, already shared some of this information, but we all know, and you think about sort of simple logic, when you look at the cost on average of 1 month for a bed or a hotel room or an apartment for a family to be sheltered, that's around $3,200 a month. The cost on average across the state for a mass rental voucher program subsidy, that's the equivalent of like a Section 8 on the federal level, if you've heard of that program. It's a subsidy that provides the difference between a family's income and the cost of housing. We subsidize at about an average cost of $900 per family per month. And so when you just think about that simple fact, you can support 3 households with a rental voucher for the cost that it takes to support 1 unit or 1 hotel motel room for a family to be sheltered. It's kind of a no-brainer. It's absolutely a smarter investment to put those dollars into expanded affordable housing and reduce the utilization of shelter. Why is this so hard? Because it is really hard. And it's hard because again, that structural gap that I mentioned, the difference between the incomes of many families, the working poor in our state, and the cost of housing is significant. And the number of families that fall into that category is quite staggering. So if you simply look at what we use as the measure for eligibility for shelter, which is 115% of the federal poverty level, which is around $18,000 for a family of 3 in Massachusetts, there are over 200,000 families that fall into that category. And if you look at those 200,000 families, if they were to need to pay the full rent for an apartment in the greater Boston area, they'd be spending 85% of that income on their housing, and that is not sustainable for many reasons. Across the rest of the state, that measure is about 65%, which again is still not sustainable. If we were to provide vouchers, this mass rental voucher program that I'm going to talk more about in a little bit, for all of those 200,000 families who any of us in this room could argue absolutely need that support to afford housing, it's a $2.4 billion a year price tag. It's staggering. That's why this is so hard. So if we know, and Christina laid this out nicely as well, that homelessness is absolutely bad for children. And if we know that housing is less expensive than shelter, how do we take this puzzle on and turn on and support and provide more affordable housing and reduce the use of shelter? Well, the way the Patrick Murray administration has done this is to design a system that seeks to serve the most families in the greatest need through increasing investments in prevention of homelessness and in the expansion of affordable housing, while at the same time continuing to support a responsible safety net and that really important entitlement to shelter that we have for families in this state. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is lay out for you how we've done that. It's been a path that this administration has been on and a commitment that Governor Patrick, in partnership with our friends and leaders in the legislature, have taken on. It's a brave challenge to take on because it's a very difficult and important challenge. And we've been working on it for the last 6 years. We're not finished. It's a process of trial and error and learning and looking at data and looking at our successes and trying to continue to push ourselves to do better. So I'm going to walk you through some of the things we've tried, share with you what I think is working, and talk to you about where we're going. So one of the first things that this governor did was established regional networks on a state level to end homelessness. So bringing together different agencies within government and different service organizations and homelessness providers and housing advocates and providers in regions across the state to work together to try to solve this problem. The governor launched Article 87 several years ago, which actually transferred the shelter programs from our human services agencies into DHCD in order to take on this problem from a housing perspective. And rather than look at it solely as a problem of providing more services, it's a problem of linking those services to the core of affordable housing, which is really the stability that families need in order to succeed, in order for adults to succeed in working, and in order for children to succeed in school. And again, we know that multiple disruptions and multiple moves for children is very detrimental to their learning. We've also invested in a comprehensive continuum, and that comprehensive continuum is a combination of, as I've mentioned, that responsible shelter safety net. We've added programs within our shelter safety net. In addition to shelter and in addition to motels, we've added a home-based program, and I'm going to talk more about that. It's an alternative to shelter, but targeted for families who are entitled to shelter under the eligibility rules. And then we've expanded our investments. We've expanded the RAFT program, which is a homelessness prevention program. That program, when this administration began, was funded at $260,000 a year. And in the current fiscal year 13, we've increased that program to $8.7 million. So that's a dramatic increase in the resources dedicated to preventing homelessness. And then we've expanded and we've strengthened our investments in permanent housing. MRVP, which is this mass rental voucher program, the subsidy that pays the difference between someone's income and their rent. We've grown that program from 36 million to this current year, 42 million, and that's proposed with another increase to 46 million in the FY14 budget. Just this year, in collaboration with the legislature, we passed a landmark new bill to create 1,000 new supported housing units by the end of 2015. And this governor has also taken on the commitment of strengthening and preserving our state public housing infrastructure in this state. We actually are a very unique state, and not only do we have a state rental voucher program, which is one of the only programs like it in the country, and not only do we provide robust prevention for homeless families, but we are one of only 4 states in the country that has state-funded public housing, and we have 45,600 apartments in this state that provide housing to families and individuals and seniors through our public housing infrastructure. And under this governor, we have doubled the subsidies both for the capital maintenance of those units, but also the daily operations of those units to improve the condition and stabilize that portfolio. And the governor is also now leading a reform effort to look at the delivery system within our public housing infrastructure to try to improve it and make it more efficient into the future. So what I want to do now is, oops, I'm sorry, I forgot to switch that slide. What I want to do now is address how our strategy has been working. And I'm going to do that through answering your questions because they were very insightful and I think got right to the heart of how are we using our resources to dedicate them to the families that are most in need and to serve the greatest number of families that we can serve, admittedly with not enough money, but with more resources in this system. So here are the questions that you all sent to me, and rather than read through this list of questions, I want to go ahead and take them on one by one. So how do we best meet the need out there? And you asked, is the 1,000 unit supported housing goal adequate for the need? And that refers to the legislation that was recently passed. And you also asked, will DHCD move to accept families in shelter who are reasonably at imminent risk of sleeping in cars and bus stations and other places not meant for human habitation? And in answering those 2 questions, I really wanted to, again, quickly remind you of the facts and then move on to what I think we're doing. Remember, there are 200,000 families living below 115% of the federal poverty level, and that's a $2.4 billion price tag. So is the 1,000 units enough? You know, no, it's not enough. Is it a dramatic improvement? Absolutely. Is it going to be fundamentally important and improve the lives of those 1,000 households that move into those units? Yes. But do we need to do more? Absolutely. And, you know, the challenge here again is, you know, limited dollars, a state legislature, and an administration that's very committed to this effort. And how do we take those dollars and most responsibly target them to those families most in need? Which gets to the second question, which I know is a hard question, and I know it's a question that everybody in this room is sensitive to in terms of how we're determining families' eligibility for shelter. And what I want to do is to talk for a minute about the way that the system is organized in terms of how people access the resource. Because, again, we know the number of families that should be entitled to housing supports, but we know the price tag of meeting that entitlement is up over $2 billion. So how do we figure out within that large population of families who have a housing need and admittedly have unstable or insecure housing situations, how do we focus that population and look at those families who are at the greatest risk And how do we target our shelter spending at those families who are at the greatest risk, so we can take those resources and, again, support 3 times the number of families through a housing program instead of a shelter program. And one stat that I wanted to share with you was that last year, when the eligibility for shelter was before it was changed, we had, at the time, an average demand or an average